This is East Cowes, gateway to the Isle of Wight from the mainland of England. It's always been an important industrial town, dominated now by GKN Aerospace. I grew up here but left about 50 years ago, when I was 15. At that time there were two main employers, Saunders Roe, who built the giant Princess flying boat and the first hovercraft, and the shipbuilders J. Samuel Wight. Now, after 50 years, I'm living back in East Cowes once again. In this film we hear the stories of 8 people who have lived here since the 1950s and recall what life was like for them at that time.
I was born in West Cowes, in Bath Road, and we came to East Cowes when I was 2 years old.
I've lived in East Cowes from the day I was born, or brought back from hospital, born in St Mary's. We lived in the prefabs up at Archon Estate until I was 7. Then we moved to the council houses in Vectis Road.
I was born in Clarence Road, near Yarborough Road. There was a shoe shop called Searles that did all the cobbling repairs, and I understand the nursing home was above the shoe shop.
What brought you to the island then?
Well, I brought an high-speed launch to Groves and Guffridge for overall, and I was billeted at West Cowes, and the woman that owned the house, she was my wife's sister. So that's how I met my wife. And of course, got married, stayed here.
My first trip to East Cowes was in 1953 on the ride Queen's Float. Our float managed to knock a lamppost down in the corner of Cambridge Road. And it took me ages to live that one down.
Why did you come to East Cowes?
Well, because I remember reading an issue of the Flight magazine, and at the time I was living in Bristol, and I couldn't like it up there. I thought I'd want to get back nearer my own home, having been born in Southampton and bred up. And I read that they were building a flying boat at a place in East Cowes. So I got on the phone, and about 3 days later the phone rang, would I come over for an interview? And that was it.
They were selling off plots of land down Old Road at £50 a plot. I remember vividly dashing from our house, which was in Kent Avenue at the time, a rented house, and dashing across the floating bridge to the solicitor's office, all out of breath, thinking they'd all been sold, because it was two plots. And no, they hadn't had anybody in. So I got the first plot in Old Road, where we are to this day.
I started school at Grange Road in 1953, in the final term, in the Easter term, because in those days you always went to school in the term in which you were 5, and my birthday was in July, so I went to school at Easter.
Do you remember your first day?
Yes, I remember my first day. I could take you to the seat in the classroom because it's so ingrained in the memory. In those days you didn't split away from your mother. You know, you tended to be at home with mum. There was no play groups or anything like that. So it came as a bit of a shock going to school. And I was taken in and I was sat down next to our next door neighbour's little boy, Desi. So it was somebody I knew. And we had a slate on the table and some chalks and a little rubber. And my mum said, draw me a nice picture. And I started to draw a house. And I said, what colour shall I do the door, Mum? Mum? And she was just disappearing out of the door. And she waved, which was a pretty silly thing to do. And tears flowed. And we had a wonderful teacher called Mrs. Fanning. And she came and scooped me up and sat me on her lap and showed me my name in the register. And she said, "Look, you belong to my class and here's your name." And I was fine. And I was fine forever after, as far as I can remember.
Can you remember the subjects that you were taught?
Specific subjects don't ring a bell, just aware of what we learnt overall. I think it got more specific as we went into the juniors. We had specific lessons. Of course, there were always the craft lessons and the art lessons and the singing lessons. A lady used to come in from outside, Mrs. Hollis, I think her name was, and to play the piano. While we had singing lessons, we used to learn all the old folk songs, which no one seems to learn anymore. But we used to listen to a radio programme that I can't remember the name of, and singing together, possibly. We also used to listen to music and movement on the radio. We used to bounce around the hall to that. I can remember we were well behaved. There must have been people who weren't. I can remember people being stood in the corner. I can remember people being sent to the head, which was an extreme form of punishment. And we had just one teacher who used to keep a little piece of bamboo stick in his desk, and he used to hit the boys with it, never the girls. But there was a bit of a kerfuffle about that, I think, and it stopped. And so did he, because he left and went somewhere else. So.
What about games? Did you use the field?
Yes, the field outside. We were allowed out there for playtimes. I think we did an awful lot of running about and handstands and things like that. It's not that I could ever do a handstand, but the thought was there. And the field was used for football for the boys. The girls played netball. When we were older in the junior school, the girls played netball, the boys played football out there. And we always had our sports day out there. They used to come and mark the field up and have sports. Not my strong point.
1953, of course, was the coronation. What do you remember of that?
I can remember some things from the coronation. At school, I don't think it was because of the school, I think it just happened in the school. We were all given a cup and saucer, a commemorative cup and saucer. And I think it was any child in the town, because my brother was 10 days old and he got one too. And they brought them they were in the hall in huge tea chests, big wooden tea chests with metal edges on, and filled with bran or straw or something, and they were diving into these boxes and pulling out the cups and saucers and giving them all, which I've still got now. Let's see it. There's one. Well, here I am in the grounds of my old school, Grange Road. I'm really looking forward to looking round inside and seeing what's changed and what hasn't, and bringing back some of the lovely old memories of school here. And this is the hall, which had dividers across it of glass and wood, which slid across in panels. In busy times, they were pulled across to make extra classrooms, or they were pushed back to make a giant hall. Going through into the main part of the building, this was the small hall where we had assemblies. The main hall was used mainly for big film shows and things like that. And off this there was the room that I started school in. Even with some of the original white tiles on the wall. And this is the third part of the separated hall, which was used as the reception class from Easter 1953 with Mrs. Fanning. And I sat here and watched my mother disappear from the door and scream the place down. Now, the junior part of the school starts here. The classroom on the left was Mrs. Milburn, and on the right, Mr. Dunford. The only difference from the infants were that the infants sat on smaller tables and chairs. When you came into the juniors, you had a desk with a lift-up lid. We came into here to do our 11+. I've had a look around the school,
and it's been wonderful to see it all again. There have been a lot of changes, but a lot of the things are still there, just the same. It felt quite strange walking around, seeing how small everything was compared to how big it all was when we were just 5 years old. But been very grateful for the opportunity to walk round and see the school now.
I actually started work on the 31st of August 1953, and I was 15 years old that day. The apprenticeship was 6 years in those days. The first thing you did when you went in there as an apprentice, you were put in our case, into the sawmill, where you assisted the machinists, really just lifting timber around and so forth. And that was for the first 3 months. And then you were moved from there into the workshop itself, onto the bench, and you were put with a mechanic. As I say, you started off making your own toolbox. That was your first task. From then on, we gradually progressed. Those days, they put you at college 1 day a week and 1 evening. So you had a certain amount of training up there, and the rest was practical in the workshop itself. And, of course, as apprentice, you always got called on to do all the lumber work. When the timber lorries arrived and that, we were always sent down to unload the lorries, and very often fiberglass in them days. There was a lot of fiberglass and asbestos, and we used to unload the lorries of asbestos and fiberglass, not realising those days the danger of the materials. Never any face masks or anything like that, so there was dust floating around everywhere. And of course, as apprentices, young lads, we used to throw it at each other. My apprenticeship finished when I was 21, but it was almost the end of national service. So I was on the borderline whether I was called up or not, and I didn't get called up until the following year, in 1960, in July, which by that time I thought I was lucky enough not to get called up, but I was on the last intake. So I went into the Royal Hampshires in 1960. Financially it was a disaster really, but you finish your apprenticeship, so you go on to a mechanic's wage. At that particular time was around £11, I think it was, per week. And you go into the forces, and that was about 27 and sixpence, I think it was then, which was, in today's money, is about £1.30 something. So you did get a little bit more as you did your time in the army, but I mean, I think the top money was about £4.50. So during that period, there was no chance of saving. I met my wife, Pat, shortly after I came back from the forces. I think it was two years after I met my wife. We got married, but The bank account wasn't too full at that time, so we rented a house then. So it was 5 years after my apprenticeship before I could afford to buy anything. Well, that's the toolbox I made when I was an apprentice. First job I did as an apprentice. There's some of my tools still in the toolbox. It's always been with me, moved from place to place.
Well, when I first came here was 1945, after the war finished.
So how did you end up as a crew member of a light vessel?
I went to Trinity House for a job, and I was working on deck on the Barndale, which was a naval boom defence ship. They were very dirty ships to be on, coal burners. You had a shower, and by the time you got back to the forecastle to get dressed, you're dirty again. But still, they did the job. And then November 1946, number 1 light vessel, which was built at Dartmouth, was put on station at the Royal Sovereign, and I joined her at the end of November. I spent 2 years there as a fog signal driver. Before the war, when they had ships that used oil lamps, the senior one was the lamplighter. The next one to him was a fog signal driver, and the junior one was a seaman. And I got promotion in 1948 to the Shambles as a lamplighter, or a senior light and fog signal driver. I did 10 years at the Shambles and moved into the Calshot, which was a senior hand station, and spent 2 years in there. I was then senior enough to be made master.
How comfortable was it on board? Did you ever sleep in a hammock?
Only in the very early days. When I went to the Calshot Spit in 1946, I did 1 month there, and we slept in hammocks. But they were fitting all the ships out with bunks.
How did you spend your spare time?
Well, the chaps, they had all sorts of hobbies. Mat making, ships in bottles. That was the main thing. Some used to do knitting. One old skipper I used to know used to do all his own socks even, which wasn't easy.
How did you look after the food on the light vessel?
We had wooden buckets, and you'd half fill it with water and put a potato in it. Then you'd add salt, and when that potato floated, you knew it was salty enough, so then you could put your beef in there, and that would keep. I didn't particularly like salt beef myself, but the lamb particularly, if you cooked it, cut it up into cubes, put it into glass jars, and put the lamb fat over it, and that would keep for months. I think the lighthouse chaps, they used to do quite a lot of that. But later, of course, when we got freezers, no problem.
So you relied on your shipmates to be good cooks?
Yes. There was one case, because we used to have, if one of the regular crew were missing, they employed extra men. And a man called Bill Cake, well known in East Cowes, ex-Navy. And well, he hated doing cooking, but he did it. And he always wore a black beret. And one day I asked him, I said, Bill, why do you put that beret on when you're cooking? You never wear it other times. Well, he said, you don't want any dandruff, he said, from my hair falling into the gravy. Of course, he forgot about the cigarette he had in his mouth, with about an inch of ash on the end of it. Yes.
We got married May the 8th, 1954, in Wight.
Do you mind me asking, how old were you?
20.
How old were you, Ian?
23.
How many raised shops were there on the island?
We had eight throughout the island. That was 2 in Newport, 1 in East Cowes, 1 at Wootton, 1 at Bembridge, 1 at Sandown, 1 at Tottenham.
What sort of shops were they?
General grocery, bacon, ham, our own cooked ham and pork, and also bread and cakes which came from the Central Bakery in Newport.
How many people were working in the shop in East Cowes?
Well, there were six to seven if I remember rightly, but it was a very stressful time for me. I was new. In Ryde I only had 1 staff, and here to jump in with that number, and mainly women, which is always a difficult. It's always difficult, but anyway, it was very worrying at the time. I remember that, but. You get over these things, you just have to get on with it and do the best you can.
The shop was very, very busy, but a hive of industry, of course, because everything was weighed, fruit and biscuits. It was great excitement because at that time biscuits came in and we had glass case in the front of the shop with different tins and you weighed your biscuits up. And of course, lots of things had been short through during the war, and people appreciated all these different things that were appearing again.
What about deliveries? Did people have delivery books, order books?
Yes, we supplied a grocery book with details in the back of various groceries right the way through, and people submitted the book in with what they wanted. We, of course, made up the orders in the shop and then delivered them by van. The deliveries were incorporated with the delivery of bread, which we had 2 vans working in East Cowes, delivering bread house to house virtually, and they delivered the groceries to those that dealt with us at that time.
I believe you also delivered to Trinity House.
Yes. There were 2 light ships, supply ships at the time. There was the Gurnard and the Brook.
That was the pilot cutters?
That was the pilot cutters, yes. Yes, they used to work from the Trinity House depot here at that time.
What about the lightsmen going out to the light vessels?
They were once a month, provisioned once a month. Although they were out for 2 months, we had to send an additional supply as required on the 2nd month. These were tied in strong cardboard cartons and had to be tied with rope, because in places with the light ships they had to be slung aboard, and like the lighthouse, the Needles and the Nab Tower we supplied as well. They were all hauled aboard, so they had to be securely tied at that time. And then when they came ashore, of course, when they finished their 2 months out there, they used to come and pay, and then they'd have time off and then come back again and submit another order when their next call was.
Can you tell me about your first Christmas in East Cowes?
Just before Christmas, after we'd decorated the shop with crackers and Christmas paper and a lot of other things, one night a gale came up and the tide came up. So you had a frantic rush to keep the water out, which in theory should work, but it didn't, because it came up the floor, down the passage, and everywhere you looked. It didn't come in the cake shop, which is a bit higher than the rest of the shop, but a very windy, wet introduction to Christmas in East Cowes.
What was your work on the Princess Flying Boat?
Well, I was the radio observer on it. The radio equipment had never been used before on any aircraft, and the standard telephones and cables installed this whole system, and I had to do an assessment of it. The first flight was on the 22nd of August 1952. I was called in because they said, oh, yeah, we're going to do some taxi tests. Came in, the crew and all that got together, and we taxied, went out to the Osborne Bay, where the aircraft was moored, all got aboard, and did the usual ground checks that you normally do. And we said, right, we'll now do a few taxi runs and see what happens. And Jeffrey Tyson, the chief test pilot, took the plane down, did a run, slow run at first, gradually increased, and before we knew it, we were in the air. So they decided to keep going, and doing all right. And that was that. And we stayed airborne for roughly about nearly half an hour in the air, flying around, covering the island most to show people, and then came back. And that was a day then, that was a flight, just the first flight. Nothing spectacular, nobody knew about it, no photographers, no press. Lovely, it was.
What was she like inside?
It was on double deck. You had an upper and a lower deck on it. And of course, at the time on the flight, it was stripped inside, and all the flight observers, all the technicians, and everything else was in there, sitting at their shop. So it was quite a lot of room. Stand up everywhere, plenty of room, both top and bottom. 2 flights of stairs, one aft and one forward. So it was good, excellent. We never landed anywhere else except East Cowes, but in the meantime we did test runs to Boscombe Down, which is in Wiltshire, because that's where a lot of the experimental work was done. And then we flew on from there on to Bristol, where we showed off the plane to the Bristol Airplane Company, who built the engines. We did 2 round flights around the British Isles, right round, and then back again, testing on long, for endurance tests and whatnot. And that's how they built up. Every flight was a little bit more possessive than the previous one. We had to do 2 or 3 runs over Farnborough, and one of them we came down really low, to 50 feet above the runway, and this flaming thing come in. Everybody had never seen a big flying boat before, let alone that low. And it was so low that I was in the Astrodome. Now the Astrodome is on the top of the plane, and it's where the observers look to see the movement of the fins and everything on it, looking up. And I was looking up at the men on the hill. famous hill at Harmber, and that was that. We did 2 runs over there. This was actually made by the Saunders Road Princess apprentices, and it's made exactly to scale, and it was made in the model shop. On the day that she flew, we didn't know, of course, that it was going to fly, and I was home, and then I was called in to use some taxi drivers, and so I said goodbye to the wife, and then when the wife went shopping in East Cowes with the children, and then coming out of the East Cowes post office, she happened to look up, and right above her was the princess. She nearly had a heart attack. That was quite a surprise for her.
I've lived in East Cowes all my life.
When did your father come to East Cowes?
As far as I can remember, about 1936, 35, 36. He was working in New Milton in a slaughterhouse, and he came over to relieve the slaughtermen in East Cowes, because there was a slaughterhouse up to the wall behind our butcher's shop in York Avenue. He stayed in East Cowes to 1939 when he joined up for the war. Obviously met Mum before 1939, and then they were married in 1944. But as soon as he was demobbed, he came back to the shop, stayed in the shop to 1950. Then there was the possibility of the shop being sold, so he went and worked in Saunders Road to 1953. Then in 53, the landlord offered him a lease, 14-year lease, which he took up. Then in 1967, as a family, we bought the business, and we were there to 2002.
Where did the name L. Smith come from?
We kept the name L. Smith because everybody knew it as Smith. And when we asked order slaves if it could be changed, it would have cost a bomb because it was cut into the marble.
Can you describe the shop?
Well, it started off as just like an ordinary butcher shop, tiling all round. And then we gradually developed it into, when the freezer trade started coming up, we went into freezers, started off small, and by the time when we finished, it was rather large, that side of it. We finished up with 300 cubic foot fridges or freezers, about 11 ordinary little freezers. It just exploded, and you know, we decided as a business it was no good competing with everybody selling, and I'm just picking these names out of the air, Bird's Eye, Ross. We had to do something different, so we were bringing stuff down from Manchester, and we were selling it cheaper than the supermarket was selling it. Took a bit of working out how to get it over, but once we got into the system, it worked perfectly. And we found there was a freezer company that would bring it over from. We could get anything delivered free from Manchester in England, but not on the Isle of Wight. But we got round that with a little bit of cooperation and sorting out. It took a little bit of sorting out, but once we got it sorted out, and my wife replaced the freezers goods every night. Six people were working in the shop. They were all family, except for when Mum was no longer able to do the cashier's job, we employed a cashier.
So you had a separate cashier's desk?
We did, and it's still talked about now if we meet people that realise where I used to work. The little cubbyhole with the lady, and we were there about, I suppose I was there about 15 years, and we decided to repaint it, and then we found that actually the cubbyhole had a thing that dropped down, and that was when it was really cold, so the cashier didn't get too cold. So we found out.
Did your father make meat deliveries?
Yes, father made meat deliveries. That's how he started. He started delivering in an old Austin 7 van. It used to take him all day on a Saturday.
Did you go sometimes too?
Apparently I did, but when I started delivering, we'd cut down the area.
What school did you go to?
I went to Grange Road School. I don't remember much about the teaching. All I can remember is I played in goal for the football team, and we won a cup. I mean, it was. I enjoyed it. It was. I wasn't the best. I was all right. I wasn't the best student, but I managed to survive. And I do remember Father going up to see the headmaster when I reached the age I could leave school or stay on. And because I wanted to leave and get in the business. The dad wanted to come up and talk to the head teacher. And Dad told me afterwards, the head teacher said, "Well, Mr. Hall, I think you'd be very good talking to the old dears." I'm not passing any further comment. I'll leave that to your discretion.
What was your first job with Saunders Row?
I was asked to do the stressing of the control system of the SR53, and that was to be done subcontract at Miles down at Shoreham, and so I had to go off down there and sort it out with them, and it was the first time I learned to be careful what you drank, to avoid getting drunk. And I'd had no breakfast and zoomed off on the boat and train. And by the time I got there, it was time for lunch, and the managing director of Miles wanted to see me. It wasn't Miles himself then. He was too old. And they took me out to lunch straight away and said, would I like a sherry? Well, I did like sherry, but they gave me a schooner and I drank that, and it was very nice indeed. And they gave me another one before I could turn round. And halfway through it, the room started to go round and round. I had to sit down. Anyway, it was all sorted out, of course, and they did a good job.
What was the SR53?
The SR53 was what was called a mixed unit fighter. It had a gas turbine engine and a rocket engine so that it could intercept a Mark III Russian bomber. And the rocket was to ascend to the height of the bomber as fast as possible.
What proportion of the SR53 was actually built in East Cowes?
All of it.
Even though it was a land plane and not a sea plane?
Oh yes, it was transported as a fuselage, and the wings had been designed to be easily taken off, and it was transported to Boscombe Down and reassembled. The SR53 first flew in 1957. Very successful flight it was.
Why didn't we build more of them?
Well, because the development of armaments in fighter aircraft, range and power and that sort of thing, was dramatically increased and involved more weight, so it had to be a bigger fighter, and that's why very quickly it was decided to have a bigger gas turbine engine and a bigger fighter, which we called the SR-177.
Was that built in East Cowes?
It was nearly built in East Cowes. It was never completed because dear old Duncan Sands decided we didn't need any more fighter aircraft in 1959 and cancelled all fighter aircraft contracts, including the SR-177.
Tell me about your involvement with the Black Knight rocket project.
When I returned from college in 1953, one of the first jobs I had to do was train new stressmen because we didn't have very many of them. And after I'd finished that, I used one of the lads, John Underwood, who later worked on Black Knight itself and Black Arrow. And he and I investigated the feasibility of a 3-foot diameter tube to contain the whole of the rocket. And we duly worked out that it was feasible, that the thickness of shell wouldn't be too heavy. And shortly after that, the company got a contract to build Black Knight.
Can you describe Black Knight?
It was a rocket with, well, 4 actual rockets powering the vehicle to check the characteristics of re-entry of a ballistic weapon, just testing various shapes and what happened to them when they re-entered the atmosphere. And but then it was discovered that there were other funny characteristics in the exhaust of the rockets, and it was thought that it would be able to detect the rocket coming by the rocket exhaust into the atmosphere. So a project called Dazzle was instigated with the Americans and the Australians, a joint contract for more Black Knights. And in the end, I forget whether it was, I think 22 were built and 20 were fired.
Where were they fired?
In Australia. The Black Knights were fired in Australia, but they were also fired here on the Isle of Wight to be tested out at Highdown.
Okay, so tell me about SRN-1.
As far as the SRN-1 is concerned, Christopher Cockrell had come up with this idea of lubricating boats by pumping air underneath the hull. And he trailed this patent with the help of a company called National Research and Development Corporation, set up by the government to develop ideas. And they trailed it to Shorts, who didn't want to know about it. And so they came on to Saunders Road because we were recognised fine boat builders. And we had our first contract in 1957 to do tests to see if his ideas did actually work. And the outcome of that was to build a manned model of a hovercraft called the SRN-1, which was tested in 1959. We were scheduled to just show the press that it could lift off and that they could look underneath it and see just air. But the press demanded that it went to sea, and so we sent it to sea and had these famous photographs taken of it passing the Queen Mary, and it was all very successful, apart of course from clouds of spray. We had to develop flexible skirts on the craft to go over big waves, and we then were able to reduce the power and airflow to produce the lift, and so we got the spray down, and particularly once it had got moving, then the spray was very minimal.
What was Sir Christopher Cockrell like?
He was a very determined individual to press his ideas, and nothing was going to get in his way, which is fair enough. The first time I met him was NRDC demanded my presence down at Yeovil, because we were then owned by Westland, and I met Sir Christopher, whose first words were, your design of an SRN4 has been designed by an aerodynamicist and a structural engineer, and it's no good. You'll have to do it again. So that was a sort of impression I had of Sir Christopher. He wasn't Sir Christopher then, of course. But later on we became very good friends, and I got on very well indeed with him. He was essentially a very nice man, and I got to love him very much indeed.
Well, it was a very lively town, and I mean, there was much more community spirit than there is today, I would say. I mean, everybody's so engrossed in their own little thing today. But then there were many things involved. I mean, we were mainly with the Carnival Committee, which took up, I mean, I was working 6.5 days a week and late evenings as well, but we always managed to fit in that, you know.
We did have some fun. Yeah. You worked hard and you played hard, really. I mean, when we went to carnivals, there was 1 or 2 every week. You didn't have a car, so you got Mr. Windsor, who used to sit in the Red Monkey to take the girls to whichever carnival. It was incredible.
I helped run the carnivals for about 25 years. Thoroughly enjoyed it. Hard work. But there again, I was quite happy to be planning it all and let other people be in the limelight.
Always in the carnival. Got pictures of every carnival with me in from the age of 2 to the age of 16, I think. There used to be the children's carnival, and they had the main carnival in the evening, and then they had an illuminated carnival as well. And it always used to end up downshore, and there was always a fairground down there, a big fairground down there.
Going back to my younger days and that, East Cowes was a place where you practically knew everyone because it was only a small town. It was difficult to get out of the town. I mean, when I was a boy, if we went on a bus ride, that was a day's out. That was a real pleasure. That was a day's outing to us. So people did everything in the local area.
I started up a badminton club in Osborne Works, which was the top works, and got quite a lot of members from there. And the good cricket clubs, good football, plenty of sports. So really speaking, I mean, it was people that had come onto the island, they did have somewhere to go. The sports club itself was quite a good centre.
It was a town that was nice to be lived in, well, it still is, but it was so different from now, and of course with East Cowes Castle there still, and all the cricketing and footballing and hockey and what have you clubs all working. It was an amazingly different town in the 50s.
When I was doing the voluntary work, like for the carnival, we knew who to go to, and people would help you out because it was local shops. You helped each other out.
In those days it was more pleasurable where you knew everyone and spent all your time in East Cowes. That was it. These days it's got so big, so many people from the mainland that's moved in that you don't know anyone now. After saying that, my wife came from the mainland as well, so...
Did you enjoy living in East Cowes?
Oh, yes, yes. I wouldn't have lived anywhere else.
Take me back home.